All right, we're at a couple past, so I think we are going to go ahead and actually get started. So again, I kind of started with introductions. My name's Andrew Kercher from Port Huron Museums, where one of our sites is, of course, the Fort Gratiot Light Station. We also have the Huron Lightship, so if not exactly a lighthouse, certainly lighthouse adjacent. But want to welcome all of you to the first of 3 webinars we're doing this year. So glad you were able to sign up. We've got a couple of presenters today, and you should be able to see them right up at the top. Adding another couple of folks here. You will see you should see our 2 other speakers, Anne and Lauren, and I'm going to let them briefly introduce themselves. So, Lauren, you're going to be starting first, so we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Lauren Nelson. I'm also with the Port Huron Museums. I am the site manager at the Fort Gratiot Light Station. I've been here since 2017. What else do we need to know?
Well, I know you'll get to talk plenty. Anne, do you want to give maybe just a brief introduction?
My name is Ann Method. With the DeTour Reef Light Preservation Society, and surprisingly enough, we're working on preserving, maintaining, and sharing the DeTour Reef Light. I've been on the board for quite a while. I'm also the Passages newsletter person, and that's about it.
All right, solid. So again, in terms, we've got a lot to cover. So we'll remind you that we do have 2 other webinars coming up, and we'll remind you again at the end. You figured out how to get into this one, so you should be able to figure out that next one as well. But February 13th and March 12th, so about a month between each of these. We've got Strategic Planning Essentials coming in February, and March 12th, we have Lighthouse Fundings, Donors and Goal Setting and Grants. Oh my, so that should be very interesting. I will also remind everyone coming up here in Port Huron, April 21st to 23rd, we have our conference. We are working diligently, weekly, even in the middle of University of Michigan championship football games, to prepare this conference for you. So we are hopefully going to be opening registration before too terribly long, but you can sign up on the email list. We're going to have some great speakers, some good food, some really great tours. That's coming up in April. If you haven't been to one of these conferences, I highly recommend it. They're a lot of fun. Great time to get together with other Lighthouse fans from around the state. But the reason we are here today is, of course, site-specific programming. And we have kind of 2 case studies, but I'm going to hand things over to Lauren to talk a little bit about the site-specific programming here at the Fort Gratiot Light Station. And both Lauren and Ann, we've worked this out. I've got all the slides kind of in one big show. So if you just let me know when you'd like to go on to the next slide, we'll keep things rolling. So Lauren, take it away.
All right. Well, hello again, everyone. Like I said, my name is Lauren Nelson. I'm with the Port Huron Museums. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. As Andrew mentioned, we do have 4 sites as part of the Port Huron Museums. We have, of course, the Fort Gratiot Light Station. We also have the Huron Lightship. We also have the Thomas Edison Depot Museum, which is right under the Blue Water Bridge there, where Thomas Edison worked as a young man. And we have our Carnegie Center downtown, which is an old Carnegie library, and that's kind of our main museum. So when you come to the Michigan Lighthouse Alliance Conference, you should be able to see some of those, if not all of them. Go to the next slide, please. All right, so just a short history of our lighthouse here. It was built in 1829. This is actually our 2nd tower. The first tower was built a few years earlier in 1825, a little bit south of where it stands today, but it only lasted for 2.5 years, and then it fell over after a storm, so kind of don't count that one. This is still Michigan's oldest, built in 1829. And It's been an active lighthouse since then. We are still an active lighthouse. So the buildings that you see here in the picture are all from different time periods. So we have the tower from 1829, the duplex, the keeper's house there in the center was from 1874. Our fog signal to the far left is from 1900. The single keeper's dwelling on the right is from 1932. So we have almost 2 centuries of history here on the site. We do focus on the 1930s specifically here, because that is the date for the newest historic building on the grounds from 1938. Next slide, please. And we are now actually a county park. It was taken over by the St. Clair County Parks in 2010. Their first big restoration project was to restore the tower itself. And then in 2012, we opened to the public. So on a daily basis during the summer, we're open 7 days a week, and we're busy every single day. But for those normal tours, we just do guided tours for groups of up to 12 people that'll take you through some of the buildings here on the grounds. Slide, please. First stop is our fog signal station. Again, built in 1900. If you've seen lighthouses, you've probably seen this same building. They're all very similar, right? Inside, we have an exhibit about the technology that was here at the Fort Gratiot Light Station. So we have our Fresnel lens in there. We also talk about the fog signals, obviously, that were here. And big news, we actually just got a replica of our signal from the 1930s on the outside of our building. So I'm very excited to show that off this summer. Next slide. The next stop is the keeper's house. Again, we're focusing on the 1930s here. So we've restored some of the rooms on this side to 1938 specifically. We actually have 2 historic images from that time period that show these exact angles in the parlor and in the kitchen. So we were able to recreate that basically 1 for 1, which is very cool. Next slide. And then, of course, we do climb the tower as part of this tour, 94 steps up to the top. Definitely the highlight of the tour, definitely the one that most people are looking forward to. So the thing about lighthouses, I'm sure as we all know, they all have a very similar history. We were all built for a specific reason, whether it's to, for example, the lighthouse here is built to mark the entrance from Lake Huron into the St. Clair River. Other lighthouses were built to mark a hazard, shoals, reefs, some to mark turning points. You know, there's a reason that a lighthouse was built. We all have different sort of lighting technologies, but they all follow a similar pattern. Whether you started out very early with the Lewis lamps, or if you started out with the electric light, there's always updates in technology. We all had keepers, good ones, bad ones. Like I said, we all have a similar history. So if you've been to one lighthouse, chances are you're familiar with this sort of pattern in history. So the difficult thing, I think, for lighthouse people in general is how do you make it interesting for people who have never been to a lighthouse, who have no idea about anything, could care less, honestly, sometimes, about lighthouses and their preservation. So how do you make it interesting for them? But how do you also make it interesting for that person who's been to 129 lighthouses in Michigan? So that's kind of what I'm going to focus on. If you'd go to the next slide, please. So this is one thing that I cannot stress enough. Everyone should read this book, Interpreting Our Heritage by Freeman Tilden. It was written in the 1950s, actually, for the National Park Service, but his 6 principles apply to just about everything that we do in this field. So first of all, I like his definition of interpretation. Usually when we think of interpretation, when I say I'm an interpreter, people ask what language. And I always have to say history. I'm interpreting history. So interpretation, according to Tilden, is an educational activity which aims to reveal meanings and relationships through the use of original objects, by firsthand experience, and by illustrative media, rather than simply to communicate factual information. Or summarize that, a revelation of a larger truth that lies behind any statement of fact. So I think anytime that we talk about our lighthouses, we do this using, for example, my tower that's an original object. Climbing the tower, that's a firsthand experience. Illustrative media, any of the pictures in my exhibits. And that tells a larger story, right? Rather than just me telling you the history of the lighthouse with no pictures, and all you have to do is look at me while I'm talking to you. That's boring. No one likes that. So that's what interpretation is. And like I said, Freeman Tilden has 6 principles, and these have been expanded upon dozens of times, but really it all comes back to these 6 main ideas. So we'll go through them quickly, and I'll give you some examples. The first one, any interpretation that does not somehow relate to what is being displayed or described to something within the personality or experience of the visitor will be sterile. So for example, try to explain what a Fresnel lens is without at least a photograph of one. It's really difficult. I've tried it. It's not easy. So having that physical object for someone to relate to is very helpful. Or again, putting the visitor in the firsthand experience. So climbing the tower is a lot more impactful than saying, oh, there's 94 steps. It's a spiral staircase. It's kind of hard when you do it 7 times in a row. That's not as exciting. Next slide, please. Second principle, interpretation. Information as such is not interpretation. Interpretation is revelation based upon information, but they are entirely different things. However, all interpretation includes information. That's a mouthful, but it's basically saying you can't just list a bunch of stuff and expect someone to make sense of that. So for example, my lighthouse had 22 keepers. Their names are George McDougall, Elliot Birch, blah, blah, blah. They were here for 6 years. That's not terribly exciting and doesn't tell me anything about the lighthouse. But if I tell you our first dozen keepers only stayed here for 2 or 3 years, starting in the 1890s, they started to stay a lot longer. For example, our longest serving keeper was here for 35 years from 1894 until 1929. What does that tell you about our lighthouse? To me, that says our lighthouse was not a very good place to work in the 1820s. This Port Huron didn't exist. This was a miserable swamp. No one wanted to be here. By the 1890s, for someone to stay here 35 years, that tells me a lot about what happened in that time period that made them want to stay here. By that point, they had libraries, they had schools, they had churches. There was a community here, so they tended to stay here a lot longer. Number 3, third principle, interpretation. Interpretation is an art which combines many arts, whether the materials presented are scientific, historical, or architectural. Any art is in some degree teachable. This one was always tough for me, but Tilden summarizes it as knowledge treated imaginatively. So we're using the materials as a basis for that education, but we treat them in a creative manner. So for example, in our fog signal building, I have a keeper's log for our visitors to write in. So I could tell our visitors, keepers had to keep a log. They had to write down everything that happened that day, any of the ships passing by, any of the duties that they did, any major shipwrecks, things like that. Or I can have the visitor write that themselves, and that is a lot more impactful. So again, that's just taking that knowledge and treating it in a more creative way. Next slide, please. The chief aim of interpretation is not instruction, but provocation. And this can be as simple as asking a question rather than telling someone. So if I was to ask someone, why do you think our light was changed from a white light to a green light in the 1930s? So that provokes them to think a little bit about why that might be. I will, of course, give them the answer or lead them to that answer. But it's also sharing information in a way that makes people want to know more, rather than just, again, listing off a bunch of facts. It can get kind of boring, and they're not going to retain any of that. Fifth principle, interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part, and must address itself to the whole man rather than any one phase. So for example, I can tell you about our tower. It was built in 1829. It is the oldest in Michigan. It's made from brick. The walls are 8 feet thick. It's 82 feet tall. Again, that's not going to mean anything to you. That's not going to make any of those connections. But if I tell you the tower was built in 1829 to mark the entrance from the lake into the river because there were rapids here, and it helped the increasing number of ships passing through due to the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. That means a little bit more and addresses the whole history of the lighthouse rather than just the building itself. It tells you why it was here rather than just it's here. Last slide, please. Next one. The sixth one, interpretation addressed to children should not be a dilution of the presentation to an adult, but should follow a fundamentally different approach. To be at its best, it'll require a separate program. And this is true. We actually do separate educational programs for elementary and middle school kids. This is a photo of our Keepers Camp. It's a 3-hour program where kids do various activities that kind of show you what it was like to be a lighthouse keeper. So it is more hands-on. One of the things that they do is they do lighthouse keeper chores. And I have never seen children so excited to handle a broom, but I guarantee you that's the thing that they remember is sweeping out the bottom of the tower with that broom. Again, I can't explain it, but it's more of a hands-on thing. And with children, you want to approach it as a more of a companionship approach rather than instruction. Because I can talk to these kids all day and give them a bunch of history facts, but it's not going to mean anything to them. So making that hands-on connection is a little bit better. And actually, for example, one of my tour guides will use the children as like physical examples to show how our light worked. We had 2 panels that rotated around the outside of the tower or outside of the lens, and that's how we got our flashing light rather than a rotating lens. So she'll take 2 children and move them around to 3rd children to like kind of show how that light worked. So again, it's a hands-on approach to the children. So hopefully they remember that a little better. Next slide, please. So again, like I said, lighthouses, we all have a similar story. We all have keepers, we all have towers, we all have fog signals, that sort of thing. So I encourage you to find your unique story. What makes your lighthouse extra special, rather than just being, you know, your lighthouse. Of course, it's all special to all of us. But I suggest definitely checking out your newspapers. Either your local newspaper, you can always look at Detroit. Cleveland is also a good newspaper to look at for Great Lakes history. If you don't know where to find these, newspapers.com is a fantastic resource. The cool thing is that you can search that by search terms, by dates, by location, by specific newspapers, and that's very helpful. You can also look at microfilm. I hate microfilm because you are literally just scrolling through black and white images of newspapers and it's not easy to use. So go to newspapers.com first. I would also suggest checking out some of the archival material that might be available for your lighthouse. If you have the keeper's logs, those are huge. We have our copies of our keeper's logs. A lot of these are going to be at the National Archives at Washington, D.C. So you might have to go there. If there's one specific thing that you know you want from the National Archives, you can reach out to them and they will send you scans or images of some of their materials. But it can get pricey if you want, you know, 100 years worth of keeper's logs. It's cheaper to just go to DC and get pictures yourself. You can also check out ancestry.com if you're doing researching about your keepers. Quite often there's photos, there's, you know, where they're buried, family members, that sort of thing. So those are all places to look for your unique stories. And when you do that, consider how you might fit that into a larger story, whether it's connected to maybe one of the world wars or some other event, major event in Michigan history, maybe the wildfires here in the thumb of Michigan, or something like that, connected to a larger story that your visitors might already be aware of or a little bit familiar with. Next slide, please. Okay, So my example here at the Lighthouse, this is kind of our big story, the storm of 1913. If you're not familiar with this, it was probably one of the biggest storms to ever hit the Great Lakes in recorded history. Obviously in 1913, November 7th through 10th of 1913, it hit just about all of the Great Lakes, but the southern end of Lake Huron is really the epicenter of it. This is where most of it went down, including a lot of the ships. And it really hit Lake Huron the worst. Lake Erie as well, basically buried Cleveland. So here we decided to tell the story of the storm from the perspective of this particular location. And this tour is a walking tour. It's different than our normal tours. So it is longer. Our normal tours are about 45 minutes to an hour. This tour is about an hour and a half. It took a different route. And I did a couple different things. I actually dressed up in period costume just because I love a good excuse to wear some old clothes. And I had a couple props. I had some different photos that I carried around. So I want to describe how I used those 6 principles of interpretation that we discussed earlier, specifically on this tour. So the first one, interpretation that does not relate to what is shown or to the visitor, will be sterile. So this image here is one of those photos that I carried with me on the tour. When we came down from the tower and I was talking about the damage, the erosion that the waves caused, I showed this picture as we were standing at the bottom of the tower. So I could point out on the tower today what we can see above ground and then what was exposed due to the storm. So again, showing that like physically where the visitors are standing, exactly what would have happened here at the storm. And I actually host these tours at the same time of year that this storm hit. This past year, I did the tour again, and it was on the exact day that the storm hit this particular location. So I think the weather also helps as well, put the visitor in that situation to make it a little bit more real for them. The first time we did this, it was freezing cold. It was miserable, which just adds to it, I think. Next slide, please. Interpretation is revelation based on information. There's a lot of information in this map right here, which I'm sure means nothing if you just look at it, unless you're a meteorologist. But if I tell you that the weather prediction at this time was not actually prediction, weather stations from all over the country were taking readings, telegraphing that to Washington, D.C., where it was plotted in this map, and then telegraphed back to all these weather stations. So this map right here, which is supposed to warn you of any severe weather coming, was about 16 hours out of date. And as we know here in Michigan, the weather can change a lot quicker than that. So that kind of puts it more into context, right? And this is also one of those images that I carried with me to describe how the storm formed. Next slide, please. Interpretation is an art combining many arts. So this was my opportunity to add a little bit more drama into what I was talking about rather than just my normal tours. Again, I put on some historic clothing, which I really enjoyed. I was a drama kid in high school, so that's just right up my alley. I used quotes from our lighthouse keeper. I used newspaper accounts from Keeper Kimball about like what he experienced. So again, just adding a little bit more drama, adding some props, things like that. So I had that information, but I used it creatively. Not an interpretation is an art, combining many arts. Next slide, please. Interpretation is not instruction, but provocation. And again, it's even as simple as asking a question. So I said, I was talking about the ships that went missing and how the local people know these ships. We've seen them a million times. It's the same thing today. In 2023, 2024, it was the same thing in 1913. They knew these ships, they knew people on these ships. So I asked, what would it be like if the Paul R. Tregurtha went missing today? Just completely missing. We have no idea where it is. I don't think that would happen today with our GPS and radar and boat nerd and everything like that. But imagine that feeling. And I hope that that provoked some of my visitors to think a little bit harder about what that means. Next slide, please. Present a whole rather than a part. So instead of just talking about November 9th and November 10th at the lighthouse, I did address the entire story. So we talked about what happened up on Lake Superior a little bit. I talked about all the shipwrecks that happened here on Lake Huron, and I talked about the aftermath of that. On the hull that we see there is the Charles Price, but they didn't know that for about 3 days. It was just a mystery ship out there. So we talked about that and how they discovered that and identified the ship. I also talked about the shipwrecks. They're popular diving sites now today. So I've actually brought out some of the artifacts from the Regina that sank in that storm. And I think that made it a little bit more real and kind of addressed the entire story rather than just, what the storm did to our lighthouse. Next slide, please. Interpretation addressed to children is fundamentally different. I didn't have any children on my first Storm of 1913 tour. They were all adults who probably knew more than I did, honestly, about the storm. But on my second tour, I did have one child who he knew so much about all the shipwrecks. It was incredible. So I kind of included him on this tour and included his information and wrapped it into my own. So again, that's providing that companionship rather than instruction. I knew that I wasn't going to be able to teach him much that he didn't already know, so I just included him. I do talk about the storm. Some of my other tours, though, where there are children. And again, it's like just putting them in that moment, making it a little bit more hands-on, using some of the other senses rather than just sight and sound. So, for example, on one of them that I gave, it was an unseasonably warm day in November. So I was like, it was a day a lot like today where it's a little bit warmer than it really should be. And the temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. So I think that kind of helped the kids imagine what it felt like at that time. And here in the photo, they're actually sitting on the hurricane wall that was built after the storm due to all that erosion to kind of prevent that should a storm hit that again. So again, feeling that hurricane wall and kind of putting that into context for them. Next slide, please. So wrapping this all up in conclusion, here's a list of resources for you to check out to help you identify that unique story. For us, it was the storm of 1913, although we've got a bunch of kind of interesting stories over 200 years of history here. So definitely check out the National Archives. There may be some items that are digitized that are available for you, but there's really not much online. But definitely check that out. You can go there. It's free to do research there. You can also check out the Clark Historical Library. That's the archives at Central Michigan University. They've got a pretty good lighthouse collection. Again, newspapers.com, very useful resource, ancestry.com. Also useful if you're doing research on your keepers. Check out your local library. They might have subscriptions to newspapers.com and ancestry.com that you can use. Also, librarians are an underused resource, and I'm sure they would be happy to help you do some research. Also, reach out to our State Historic Preservation Office. Some of us may not have a great relationship or great opinion of them because they tell you what you can and can't do sometimes, but they're also a really great resource and good friends to have. And finally, definitely read Interpreting Our Heritage by Freeman Tilden. It's a super easy read. It's about 100 pages. You can do it in an afternoon, and there's lots of great information, lots of great examples in there. And you can use those 6 principles that we talked about today to do your daily tours. You can use them to write exhibit text if you're doing that. You can use it to write a grant narrative. You can use those principles. Like, you have to make that connection with the grant reviewer, and these principles are a great way to do that. So definitely check those out. The book's super cheap on like Amazon or thrift books or anything like that. You can get it pretty easily. There's lots of copies around. So that's what I've got for you today. I would be happy to answer any questions at the end of this presentation after Miss Ann speaks. And thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I'll also note, if you aren't paying attention to the chat, Mike Vogel wants to let everyone know that at the U.S. Lighthouse Society, they also have a database, several gigabytes, as they're absorbing some of that lighthouse information. So another one of those great sources. So I think some really great stuff. I will also take this brief second to remind everyone that the presentation today has been recorded. We're going to edit it down a little bit. Just chop off some of the stuff of us getting things set up at the beginning, and we'll be able to share that out to everyone who is here today. So you'll be able to go back and check this out. But I think now is the time we're going to turn things over to Ann as we are on to the next section of our presentation. Oops.
You did. There we go. Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate having the opportunity to talk to everybody. Lauren, you hit some really great points, and I hope I can back them up with what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to tell the story of DeTour Reef Light. Slide, please. The DeTour Reef Lights, it's a mile offshore in the St. Mary's River. And next slide, please. You can see from the map where we are. There's this I-75 Mackinac Bridge, and keep going east until you get to almost Canada, and there we are. As I said, we sit a mile offshore, and we believe, in fact, we're pretty sure we're the first offshore lighthouse to have an overnight keeper program. Next slide, please. The original lighthouse was built in 1847. It burned. I couldn't find a picture of that one. The second light, DeTour Point, not DeTour Reef, DeTour Point, lasted until 1931 when it was decided that an offshore lighthouse would do a better job. So if you look at that tower, you aficionados will recognize that that looks an awful lot like Whitefish Point's tower. And it is. It's the same design. In 1931, they took that tower and embedded it into the center of DeTour Reef Light. So that tower is a Civil War era tower encased in a 1931 frame. Next slide, please. In 1997, I'm sorry, 1997, the DeTour Reef Light Preservation Society decided that it was time to restore the light that had been shut down since 1974. So here's where we started. You notice there's no cranes, everything's boarded up. It was still an active aid to navigation. So the Fresnel had been replaced with a more modern light. But that's where we started. Okay, keep going, please. Next slide. And here's where we are today. It's still an active aid to navigation. It still sits a mile offshore, but now we're doing tours and keepers. What I want to talk about today, however, are the stories and how we found the stories. Next slide, please. One of the early things we did was put together an educational exhibit. Next slide, please. John Koval, with the guidance of our historian, Chuck Feltner, decided that they wanted to build a 1/12 scale model of the crib that the DeTour Reef Light sits on. And John spent a long winter designing and manufacturing this replica 1/12 scale. If you look on the left, there's a picture of the crib in process. What we think happened is they built the first couple levels onshore, pushed pulled or shoved the crib out onto the water, floated it, and finished building it. And then it got towed out to the reef. There's a whole lot more story attached to that, and that's a tour story. So I'm trying to tease you a little bit. Next slide, please. Also, oral histories. Next slide, please. Early on, Chuck Feltner made it a goal, I believe, to talk to as many of the past keepers as possible. Now this is about 2000. The lighthouse has been closed since 74. So the minimum age of the keepers is probably right around 46, 47, but more of them were 70s and 80s. He was able to get this group of guys to come to our 10th anniversary celebration in 2008. And I love the nicknames. Some of them are pretty obvious, Ski, Ole, JP, but where boats came from, or Blackie, or the Owl, I don't know. But they sat for an entire afternoon telling story after story of the goings on the light. Next slide, please. One of them developed into a mystery. Steve Lovett, he's the guy on the right, on the left of the right-hand picture, had gone to DeTour to pick up the mail, and he found these three young ladies. I don't know where he found them, but he found them and said, come on out and have lunch with us. So they came out, and you can see they were in the kitchen. I don't know if they were cleaning it or cooking it or what they were doing. They sat around eating the meal, and one of them even got up to the tower and got to see the 3.5 order Fresnel lens up close. Well, the party was just getting started when the ship to shore comes on and says, hey, the commander's coming from the Sioux for a surprise inspection. Where do you hide three ladies on an offshore lighthouse with a full inspection? Well, slide. Not to be deterred, these young men found an attic, put them in the attic, closed the door, and told them to be quiet. The lower left is a picture of an overhead picture of the lighthouse, and that square, that gold square, that's the area of the attic that they were in. And that's the actual attic they were in. Well, the inspection went really well. The commander left. They let the ladies out. They were covered in dust, spider webs, spiders. The party was over, and off they went home, probably never to return. We have looked, we have publicized, we have tried so hard to find who these ladies are to get their version of the story. They're probably in their 80s, and I don't think they were local girls, because we talked to most of the locals and they didn't have any idea who these people were. So that's one of our fun stories. Next slide, please. Charlie Jones was on the light for 22 years. And here's this, I've seen this picture in the previous slide, but there's Charlie on the right. He was from the Lighthouse Service, never was part of the Coast Guard, but he was there until 1962. And the episode with the ladies occurred because he was on his rotation off the island. There were 4 keepers, obviously, well, not obviously, the fourth one in the picture on the right was the one that took the picture. But there were four guys on the light, and they rotated once a week. They got off out of a month. Charlie was off the light at the time, because this would not have happened if Charlie was on the light. He did 40 years as a Lighthouse Service employee. Next slide, please. There was a tragedy as well as everything else that went on. Don Ashley drowned on the St. Mary's River, March 30th, 1971. I want to read a note that his brother sent us, and it's very moving. The winter of 1970-71 was extremely cold, producing significant ice, which led to a late opening of the shipping season. The U.S. Coast Guard commander was anxious to get the system up and running as the weather had caused the opening to be delayed twice already. 3 Coast Guardsmen departed DeTour Village Harbor in a 16-foot tender with limited supplies. The ice was breaking up, but they reached their destination safely, scaled the 20-foot ladder to the platform, probably full of ice, and chipped the winter accumulation of ice off the entry door to the tower. They entered the structure and started the power generator to initiate another season of manning and running the DeTour Reef Light. Don Ashley volunteered to go back to DeTour Harbor by himself for more supplies and to pick up another crew member. On his way to shore, the tender was caught between ice floes and capsized. Don was thrown into the water. His 2 fellow U.S. Coast Guard mates heard his distress call, but had no rescue equipment available. They watched him make progress toward the lighthouse while swimming for about 20 minutes. After a large wave washed over him, Don never resurfaced. The Drummond Island ferry answered the emergency call to no avail. A U.S. Coast Guard helicopter was dispatched by divers, but it was judged too dangerous to search for his body at the time due to conditions. Because of the ongoing stretch of harsh weather and significant ice conditions, there was no river traffic for the next 14 days. His remains were never recovered. At the 50-year mark, DeTour Reef Light and the U.S. Coast Guard held a ceremony to honor Don's service. His brother and sister came. We had the U.S. Coast Guard band. We had the local choir. We had quite an extravaganza, and the result of it was a plaque that was placed on the light in his honor. Next slide, please. Eric Olson summed up his time on the light, and I think it's a very moving statement. It's the good you do. Hundreds of people depended on the light. The light didn't fail. And that came from the 2008 gathering of the light keepers. Next slide, please. So where did the information come from? This is a little redundant after Lauren's presentation, but I'll do it anyway. We had some grants for research. Chuck and Sherry Feltner made it to the archives as suggested and found the keeper logs. Family contributions and pictures. Gene Anderson was a photographer that took so many pictures, including the pictures of all those ladies. And our historian, Chuck Feltner, he located multiple past Coast Guard keepers, listened to their stories, some one-on-one. As I said, the 10th anniversary where he gathered the past keepers. He was instrumental in finding all this information out, and we owe him a debt of gratitude. Next slide, please. Jerry Feltner, same last name as his spouse, has put together has written a book that's coming out in March called DeTour Reef Light: History, Preservation, Restoration, Preservation, and Public Access of an Offshore Michigan Lighthouse. And we're looking forward to it. And I'm sure there'll be more information coming either on the DeTour Reef Light Facebook page or even possibly the MLA page. Next, please. So after all our efforts, we do have an active lighthouse keeper program. We also do tours. We would love to have you come and visit and just see what we've accomplished. It's a beautiful offshore lighthouse. I'm not prejudiced at all. Next slide, please. So for more information, www.drlps.com. It's loaded with historical information, with every Passages newsletter that's ever been published is on the website, and activities, calendars. Thanks so much for listening to me. And Andrew, I believe it's your turn again.
All right. So thank you so much, Anne. And again, thank you so much to Lauren. So I think this would be a great opportunity for questions. So if you've had any kind of formulating kicking around, you can always add those in the chat or kind of unmute. I know one of the things that some of the themes that we've seen is, where to find some of that information because each lighthouse is unique and has their own story to tell. And those are some of the tools with which you can do it. I think Lauren really expertly demonstrated about how you can even have a normal program and then some kind of special programs that are unique to that light, and some really amazing things to do on a reef light as well. So I learned some stuff as well today from you, Ann. So I think this is some really great information. And hopefully it's given you, maybe if nothing else, kind of a skeleton to hang some of your ideas upon for whichever lighthouse that you might like to visit, or you might be involved in running or picking out those programs for. One of the challenges I know that I've sometimes had is, and I think anybody who has worked long-term as an interpreter or in the museum field, that's easy to forget, is that sometimes when you tell the same story, every single day, it can be easy to forget that it's going to be new for somebody visiting for the very first time. I can tell you my experience. I worked up in the Straits of Mackinac and would talk a lot about, say, the British soldiers who were working at Michilimackinac, which is where I spent a lot of my time. And every once in a while, we'd be so excited and geeked out when we'd find out some new, very obscure fact, because it was new information to us, forgetting that every single day, the people who are coming into that site, it's all new to them as well. So sometimes, even though so many lighthouses are similar or will share similar facets of the story, that for the people visiting them, it might be it's their first time. It might be the only lighthouse they visit that year or ever. We get a lot of people who visit lots of lighthouses, but I'm sure you've all had people at some of your sites visit a lighthouse, and it's the very first time that they've gotten a chance to come to one. So that's a pretty amazing opportunity for anyone who get to do that, to introduce people to that amazing world that is lighthouses. So I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but if anybody does want to either throw one up there, or you can unmute yourself, feel free to turn on your camera or anything. This is where we can take any of those questions. Again, while you're thinking about that and formulating this, I hope that you were able to glean something useful for this to take back to your site. I will remind you all of 2 more upcoming webinars in February and March that we are very excited to host. So these are just one of the services that we offer at Michigan Lighthouse Alliance. We're for all of the lights, all 129 around the state of Michigan. We have so many. I always joke. I always wonder if there's an Indiana Lighthouse Alliance. It's just the one. But we have so many lighthouses here in Michigan that we obviously all work together to tell that story of our individual lights, as well as the collective story of the lights here in the state. And I will again put in a nice plug for the upcoming conference. This is a conference we have every other year. So a couple of years ago, this was over in Holland. So now we're on the other side of the state. A really cool opportunity to see some behind the scenes stuff at some of the Port Huron Museum sites. We're co-hosting this conference in April. It's going to be at the Blue Water Convention Center, which for my money is the coolest convention center in the state. It's right underneath the Blue Water Bridge. If you've ever seen they have a ship cam there. It's one of the most popular. And it's a pretty amazing place. So you can come see that. So here's a question, probably for you, Ann. Does DeTour Reef own their own vessels, or do you contract with private contractors for transportation to the light?
Good question. The first many years, we were blessed with a private contractor that was probably the best boat captain I've ever known, and I think other people will agree. Sadly, he decided to retire, so we've been casting about, and we've located another private contractor to be doing it. The maintenance of the boat just seems to be more in the cost than we want to handle, so we've been doing private contractors.
Solid. Mike Vogel asks about Port Huron. Are we affiliated with the local government, admission, or tour fees? So that's another pretty good question. So we're actually a 501c3, so we are not directly associated with the city government. We don't get taxpayer dollars or anything like that. We actually, some of our sites, we have 4 different sites, as Lauren alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. 3 of the sites, everything but the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse, are technically owned by the city and then leased by the museum. And we're actually fortunate enough, we have received some grant funding so we can offer free admission at the Huron Lightship, the Thomas Edison Depot, and the Carnegie. Now, the Fort Gratiot Light Station, I think, is another kind of unique thing. We operate that. I've kind of described it as a three-legged stool. The museums run the day-to-day operation. It is actually owned by the county government. So it is a county park that is open. The grounds are open year-round. We give the tours basically spring and fall on weekends, and then summer we're 7 days a week. And then there's also a Friends of the Fort Gratiot Light, which is a separate 501c3 that is just a fundraising arm. They do things like Sandfest is our biggest event every year, brings in several thousand people. The Great Lakes Sand Sculpting Championships, which are on the grounds of the Lighthouse. So there is, because the grant is from the city, so currently there is still a $10 admission fee that's basically covers your private guided tour of all the buildings at the grounds. And it also includes the Fort Gratiot Post Hospital, which is the oldest wooden structure basically in the thumb that will hopefully have some finished exhibits later on this summer. It's the only building that we know of for sure that's left from the original Fort Gratiot, from which Fort Gratiot Lighthouse Station gets its name. But all of that is included in that conference. So if you come to the conference, you get to see all of those sites for free. One of the questions for everyone here, DeTour Reef has found that the internet is the best way to promote the lighthouse and attract keepers to participants. What has been the experience of other lights? Well, I don't mean to speak for Lauren, but I can tell you, since Lauren and I work for the same site, and I happen to be in charge of marketing and advertising for museums, I will do my best to field that question. We work, another resource we work with to promote our sites, I think that hasn't been talked about. We, of course, love the internet. We love our Facebook page, and social media is very popular. We also like working with our local Convention and Visitors Bureau. We really view ourselves, and I think rightly so, as the #1 tourist attraction in essentially the whole thumb. We get tens of thousands of visitors to the light, being here in Port Huron, being very close to the Blue Water Convention Center. So we tell them, hey, we want you to use us as a tool. So anytime like Under the Radar Michigan shows up, or somebody's coming to promote the area, I remind my contacts there, I got a set of keys to the lighthouse, and you give me 10 minutes, I can be there, and we can get somebody to the top of the tower. And it's a pretty amazing experience to offer people in promoting the area. So that's always a very useful tool. And I think that you can work with local governments, local convention centers, visitor bureaus, and promote yourself as a tool for them, because lighthouses are something that naturally people want to see if they know they exist. That's a great way besides some of those. Here is one more question we have from Thunder Bay Island. This is from Susan, which is 14 miles offshore. So finding a private contractor to provide tours is difficult. Is a government entity more inclined to be in a position to contract for this service? So, Anne, you're the islander here. I'll let you maybe field that one.
Well, we're privately owned, so I guess I didn't hear the total question. What was the last part of it?
Is a government entity maybe more inclined to be in a position to contract for this service?
I'm not sure what that question is asking.
So I guess that is an interesting question. I suppose it all depends. Every lighthouse is, again, keeping with our theme, is different. So that might be something that a local government, if it could be sold to them as a tool for tourism, as a driver for economic engagement, that's maybe a tack you might explore. I know we've done that with the city of Port Huron in being able to provide for our free admission. Is that, well, you know, we got lots of great restaurants in town, but a lot of people probably wouldn't drive all the way up from Detroit to eat at one of our restaurants downtown. But we do have an amazing old lighthouse. A lot of people will drive up in that way. And then when they're done touring the lighthouse, what do they want to do? They want to go eat at a restaurant. So, yeah, the liability exposure for a 501c3 is pretty huge when it comes to that. Yeah, that is a challenge. Certainly, I think it's one of the things we might have to have a special session or a roundtable on just reef lights, because there are so many unique challenges to those. As Lauren alluded to, we are so lucky to be right here in a town. I don't know, Lauren, any thoughts on reef lights, boats?
I don't have a ton of experience with reef lights. obviously I've visited a few. I've visited a few on islands. To me, as a visitor, the challenge was always, how do I get out there? So I think maybe just advertising the fact that you can visit DeTour Reef, you can visit the Port Austin Reef Light, you can visit St. Helena on that remote island up in the Straits. I think that would honestly go a long way. As far as working with government entities, one of the things that I've found working with the government is they're often not allowed to do these sorts of things. Working closely with the county like I do at the Lighthouse, there's a lot of red tape. For example, I went on a trip up to Mackinac with one of the county folks, and they had to stop at a specific gas station to get gas for their county vehicle. It's ridiculous. So that's one of the great things about being independent 501c3s, independent museums, is that we don't have to jump through all those hoops. There's not a lot of red tape. Of course, there's drawbacks to that, and there is a lot of liability. And that's something that, I mean, we're concerned with too, even just having people climb up the tower. We have certain rules that we have to follow. So I don't really have any great advice on working with entities, except that sometimes they can't. They may want to, but they're just not allowed to.
Yeah, Jody mentions in the chat, at the Port Austin Reef Light, we have our captains who are separately licensed and insured, and the Lighthouse has their own boats. So interesting. And Mike Vogel mentions a future note in Buffalo, winds are hitting 70 miles an hour today. Whew, that's a lot. So deep in planning the Erie Canal Bicentennial 2025, and the resumption, the Triennial National Maritime Heritage Conference in September of 2025. U.S. Lighthouse Historical Society will be a big part of that, and we're thinking a symposia on lens restoration. I know Lauren will be very excited about that. And storm erosion, climate change impacts on light stations. So we'll have to keep our eyes open for that. But we have reached about the end of our hour or so. So I again want to thank everyone for coming today. Hopefully you enjoyed this webinar, gleaned something from it. We will again get this edited and posted out to you, so you'll be able to go back and stop. You should be able to contact any of us through our respective places. Again, both Lauren and I work for Port Huron Museums. We're pretty easy to get a hold of. But we hope to see you at some of the future webinars that we host, and we really hope to see you in Port Huron in person in April. So you can sign up for some information on that. And as I mentioned, we'll hopefully be opening regular registration before too terribly long here, and we'll see you here in Port Huron. So thank you, and hopefully everyone has a great rest of your day.